So we started the previous session talking about how sensor size affects the depth of field that you can get when you're shooting. And this is one of the things that you're going to need to look at when you're purchasing a camera or making a camera purchase decision. Now, traditionally or currently, the big trend is for large sensor cameras. So this camera here, this is Sony's FX9, is a large sensor camera. It has a full frame sensor in it. And so does this camera here. This is Sony's FX6. And if I take the lens off this and bring it up to the camera, you can see just how big that sensor is. It's a full frame sensor, very similar to the sensor that you'd find in a lot of stills cameras. And what this large sensor camera means is that you get a shallow depth of field. So if we look at the FX9 here, and we look at the images from that, we can see that we have the flowers in the foreground, and then the background is blurry and out of focus, and that's from the shallow depth of field that this large sensor gives us. Right, so that's a large sensor, and then we looked at a very small sensor. So this is Sony's Z90, and actually this isn't a very small sensor, but it's certainly a smaller sensor. This is a 1-inch sensor. And if I plug this camera in, and we have a look at the output from this camera, and I zoom in to a similar amount, you'll see that the background is staying in sharp focus. So this is a much deeper depth of field. And that can both work for you and against you. It can work for you in that your focus is much less critical, so you don't have to be quite so concerned about focus. You can also have much deeper depth of field. So if you're doing news, current affairs and things like that, where you're trying to capture a breaking news story, where you don't want just one tiny bit of your image in focus, you actually want to see what's going on, that deeper depth of field can be really beneficial. The shallow depth of field, though, gives you that more sort of film-like look and feel, because a film camera, the cameras used to shoot movies these days, cameras such as Sony's Venice, they're either using a full frame sensor or a sensor size called Super 35, which is still a pretty big sensor. Now I'm just going to swap out the FX9 for a moment. Let's just put that out of the way, and going to look at the Z280 from Sony. So it's this camera here, Sony Z280. And this is a real workhorse news, documentary, current affairs camera. So this has 3 sensors in it, but they're relatively small. 3 4K sensors, 1/2 inch is the size in this camera. And again, if we look at this, we'll find we have a deeper depth of field than we have with the FX9. So just zooming in, you can see again that the background stays in sharp focus. We have that deeper depth of field. But the big thing that you get with this type of camera, where you have a smaller sensor and a built-in lens, is a very big zoom range. So I can zoom in and zoom out, and we have a tremendous zoom range. You can see that we can completely fill the flowers, fill the frame with the flowers, zoom out, very wide shot. You can see the whole of that Venice banner on the right-hand side. Now, when we go to the large sensor cameras, if we put the FX9 back up here, this is our full frame sensor again. And if I zoom all the way out, in fact, let's zoom in all the way in first. So that's zoomed all the way in. And if you remember with the Z280, those flowers are completely filling the frame. And if I zoom all the way out, you can see that we don't see nearly as much of the door on the left-hand side, and the edge of the Venice poster on the right-hand side is just a little bit cut off. So we just don't have that same zoom range. And that's why a camera like this one, the Z280, is so popular for news and current affairs. Because although it isn't quite as film looking, we can, if you're filming let's say something happening at an airport and you need to film an aeroplane that's on the other side of the airport from a fence, you can get a bigger shot or a bigger view of the airplane all that distance away because of the zoom lens. And then you zoom out for your interviews and everything else. It's a very fast camera to work with as a result, very quick, very easy, very simple. You don't need to keep swapping lenses to get different shots. So those are sort of broadly the sort of key or the main types of cameras that we do have. Now, just a reminder, so hopefully some of you are rejoining this session following our problem with the earlier session, is that this session is for you to ask questions. I know there were some questions before in the previous session, but I can't see those now. So if you do have any questions, please keep them coming. Please ask away, because this session is for your benefit, not for mine. Now, the other style of camera that we just started looking at previously was this type. This is your sort of what's called a mirrorless camera. This is a Sony Alpha. And then we also have Sony's new FX3. And these are very compact mirrorless cameras, kind of, but this one in particular, but it's based on a stills camera. You can actually take photographs with this. Now, the issue, or maybe not an issue with this camera, it's a very different style and type of camera, really more aimed at stills photography than video. This camera shoots beautiful high quality video, has Sony's S-Cinetone curve, which makes shooting very, very easy to get really, really beautiful images. But the shape and the layout is quite different to a camera like this. And this sort of shape can become a little bit of a problem if you start trying to put a lens like this, very big, very heavy lens, on the front of a camera like this. It gets difficult to hold. And there's no way easily to mount this on your shoulder as there is with a camera like this. But these tend to be more affordable. Again, this is a full frame sensor, so you get that shallow film-like depth of field. You can also shoot with something called S-Log3 in this camera. And S-Log3 is a very different workflow to a traditional video production workflow. You shoot with S-Log3, and it's the best way to think about it is as a digital negative. And then you take that digital negative, that very high quality image, into post-production, and you grade it and adjust it. Just to give you an idea of how that looks. So at the moment, the FX9 here is using a curve called S-Cinetone. So this is Sony's S-Cinetone curve, and it looks really quite pretty, quite nice, very easily. If I go to the log shooting mode on this camera, and I can do that from the touchscreen here, and I go to the Cine EI mode, this now is log. And you can see that the colors are washed out. It's very flat. It doesn't have much contrast. It certainly isn't a pretty image. But what this is doing is allowing you to capture everything that the camera delivers so that you can then take it into post-production and you can adjust it and grade it and make it look the way you want it to. So for very high-end production, where quality is everything, you would use S-Log3 or RAW and then take it into post-production and grade it and manipulate it to make it look the way you want. But that's time-consuming. You've got to work hard at it to really get the best results. It's not as easy, it's not instant, it's not direct. So that type of workflow is really best suited to drama, to movie production, to very high-end commercials and stuff like that. Whereas if you're doing corporate video, television news and things like that, you want to look like this. You want an image that straight out of the camera is perfectly acceptable. So I do have some questions that have come in now. And again, I apologize for having to break up the sessions. One of the things I want to look at in a moment is audio. So it was really important that we got that right. So looking for a lens suggestion for the FX6. So the FX6, for those of you that don't know, is this camera here. Another one of those large sensor cameras. And you can put a tremendous range of lenses on these large sensor cameras, because you can put not only the Sony E-mount lenses that the cameras are fitted with a native mount for, but you can use adapters. And using those adapters, you can put on a lens for a photo lens, perhaps. You could also put on a cinema lens for a cinema film camera, and pretty much any lens. So one that I see that Mark is saying he has the Xene CFs with EF mount, and they're good lenses. There's no reason to not use those lenses. I've tested them against some very, very high-end and much more expensive lenses, and they really do hold their own. So I'm not sure that you're going to gain any tremendous amount by upgrading those lenses. You can put anything you want. I mean, you can put your my mind's gone blank, but you can put anything you want on here. You could put on something like a nice Zeiss lens, spend a lot of money on it, and actually it's not going to look fantastically better. The difference will be very small. And lenses is very much a personal choice. So when you're choosing a lens, it's really important that you actually look at what that lens delivers based on what you want. It's very common right now to use sort of vintage lenses on these cameras. So you can get an adapter and use some old Nikon, old Sony, old Canon lenses on these cameras to get a more vintage look. And they tend to be a bit softer. Maybe people would describe it as a creamy look. And if that's the look that you want, fantastic, absolutely great, no problem. You can find them on the sort of eBay and places like that really cheaply. But if you're trying to produce something that's modern, has a really sharp, stylish look, perhaps, you're better off perhaps starting with a higher quality modern lens, which is a bit sharper, because you can always take that sharp, crisp, clear look into post-production and degrade it if you need to make it look a bit more creamy, to make it look a bit softer. It's very difficult to take something that's soft and then make it look sharper in post, whereas it's much easier to take something that's sharp and degrade it in post. Other people looking for lenses for the FX6, the 2835, looking for something wider for news and documentary. So this comes back to this issue when we have cameras like this with a large sensor of actually the laws of physics. Is the bigger you make that sensor, the harder it is to make a zoom lens in particular that will remain and track its focus as you zoom in and out. It's something that's called parfocal. So as you zoom in and zoom out, if we look at the FX9 as an example, so this is the 28 to 135, let me just put the camera back into the normal mode. So we have a nice and more contrasty picture. There we go. And what we mean by parfocal is the ability to zoom in, and it's nicely in focus. I'm using, go for it, manual focus here, get it in focus, and zoom out, and the focus doesn't change. There is absolutely no change to the focus as we zoom in and out, and that's what we call parfocal. And that's really important if you want to use the zoom during your shot. A photo lens, a stills lens, often the focus will change. So I'm just going to swap cameras here. I'm going to put the FX6 up here for a moment, because I actually have a stills lens on the FX6. This is a very nice lens. It's a Sony 28, so 24 to 70 G Master lens, really nice lens. Take the lens cap off, that always helps. Okay, and let's just have a look. I know that this lens is pretty close to parfocal. So we start here. Let's just brighten that up a little bit. And we're in focus. So actually autofocus on at the moment. Let's just turn that to manual focus. And as I zoom out, yeah, we've lost focus there. The shot there, you might not be able to see this in the stream, is slightly soft. It's not quite in focus. If I bring it back into focus, there, I'm focusing on the flowers, and now I zoom in, it's slightly off. And I just have to tweak it. Now, it's pretty good, and to be honest, with a lens like this, you're probably very often going to use the autofocus. So and the autofocus will take care of those small changes, but it's one of the big differences between a lens for a stills camera and a lens designed specifically for video is they tend to be parfocal. And coming back to it, these big sensors, it's very expensive to make parfocal zooms. So if you want something that's a wider parfocal zoom, your choices are very limited. You do have the new Sony 16 to 35 power zoom, and that's a very nice lens, but it is only a 16 to 35 range. So if you're looking for that all-round sort of holy grail lens for news, it doesn't really exist, to be perfectly honest, for a full frame sensor. The closest that you can get without breaking the bank in terms of money is Sony's 28 to 135, that lens that we've got on the FX9 here. And that lens works really well. If you want to go a bit wider, I believe there is, I think Zunao are bringing out a wide angle adapter that you can screw onto the front of the lens that will make it wider. But then, of course, it's not as long as the telephoto lens as well. So I believe that's coming fairly soon, and you'll be able to perhaps use that. Ed says, I'm shooting S-Log3 and trying to overexpose by 2 stops. What should I set my zebras to? Now, Ed is using the Z280. That's this camera here. And this camera also has that S-Log shooting mode where you shoot with the flat image, grade it in post-production to get a really nice finished result. Now, this camera does have 1/2-inch sensors, so these are a bit smaller. This is that trade-off that you have to play. If you want that nice zoom lens where you can zoom in and out and everything else, you have smaller sensors. Smaller sensors tend to be a little bit less sensitive to light, and as a result, this camera is a little bit more noisy than most of the large sensor cameras. That's just the way the laws of physics and optics work. So Ed is saying he overexposes by 2 stops with the S-Log3, and that's a really good idea, because by exposing the S-Log3 brighter, when you have a camera that's noisy, then that gets over that noise limitation. And he wants to know what the zebra level is to do that. So if you're using zebras to expose a piece of white paper, and when we talk about exposing white with log, we tend to be talking about a piece of white paper. The normal level for S-Log3 would be 61%, then +1 stop would be about 68%, and +2 stops would be about 76%, something like that. So for a white piece of paper, just a little over 70%. And one of the things about that is actually what that means is you can leave your zebras at 70% in a camera like this. The same actually with the FS7 and the FS5 cameras from Sony, which are also a little bit noisier. And then when you're shooting with log, expose your piece of white paper so they're completely over that white paper, completely cover the white paper. And then when you're shooting with the normal gamma curves and shooting conventional gamma, 70% zebras on faces and skin tones. If you want to use faces and skin tones, +2 stops is going to be, I'm just trying to do a bit of mental arithmetic, it's going to be about 64%, something like that. So a little 60, 62%, 64%, something like that for skin tones, for typical skin tones, for S-Log2 with +2 stops. Important note is you only need to do that with cameras that are noisier. It's not something you need to do with every single camera. It depends on the camera. If you're shooting with the FX6, FX9, FX3, A7S Mark III, all these newer cameras, they are much, much less noisy, so there's no need to overexpose anymore. So your S-Log3 white would be exposed at 61%, and your skin tones would then be about 55% if you want to use zebras on skin tones. Right, so coming back to the Z280 to fully answer Ed's question, small sensors, S-Log, etc. Unfortunately, it is going to be difficult to get past the extra noise that you have with this camera. You will need to do a little bit of perhaps noise reduction in post-production. Really, this is a news camera. This is a camera that's first and foremost designed to be fast, quick, easy to work with, great zoom range, have all the streaming capabilities that it has and everything like that. In terms of a sort of cinema and film style productions, that's not really where this camera is. You can shoot with S-Log3 with this camera, but it doesn't have the dynamic range of a camera like this. It's not in that same league. So don't expect to get the same results when shooting with S-Log3 with a camera like this, very much a news, documentary, run and gun camera. Don't expect to get the same results as you would get from a dedicated large sensor cameras. And that comes back to the original part, the very beginning of this session really, was that it's really important that when you buy your camera that you make the right choice at the outset, because you're tying yourself in to those workflows. If you want quick, easy, fast, all-in-one camera, big zoom range. If you want film-like cinema quality, large sensor, full frame, Super 35, but your workflow is going to be a little bit more complicated because you will have to do that post-production grading, etc. Is there a camera setup you would recommend for a fixed installation, in particular hybrid fitness studio with live classes and things like that? In the world of sort of fixed cameras and things like that, it's not something we're really going to get into today. That's a whole different area, studio cameras. I think just for what you've described there, and again, it depends a lot on the budget. So how much money do you want to spend is always a huge factor in these things. You wouldn't go all that far wrong with a camera like this, the little Z90. This produces a really pleasing image. It doesn't need crazy amounts of light. The screen on the back is nice and large. You have autofocus that works really well, and it makes a pretty picture. And this camera, in fact, the Z90, can actually stream to YouTube, to Facebook, and things like that directly. You don't need any extra hardware other than a Wi-Fi connection to stream with this camera. So as an all-in-one, one-piece solution for something like that, you really don't be put off by its size. I know a lot of people look at this camera because it really is so small and think, oh, that can't be any good. It's much too small. But the reality is it does produce a really nice picture, and it can stream directly. You have a good zoom range, so it's nice and wide. You can see actually of all the cameras of the Z280, of all the cameras we've put up so far, this is actually the widest, because you can see the whole of that door and the whole of the Venice banner. And we've got a good zoom range as well, so we can zoom right in. And with a decent tripod, and that's a really important thing, is the tripod. It's all very well having a great camera, but if you don't get a decent tripod for it, it's actually quite difficult, especially if you're zooming in a long way. I mean, I'm a professional cameraman. I've been doing this for decades. And this has stabilization. If I stop breathing for a minute, it's really difficult to get a stable shot. So do invest in a good quality made for video tripod, not a photo tripod. Photo tripods, they're great for locking a camera in position to take a picture, but if you try to move it, they tend to be juddery, sticky. It's very difficult to get smooth movement and smooth motion. If I show you the FX6, this camera here, so this is on this is a particularly nice tripod, a proper video tripod. You can see how smoothly I can move the camera. And I can adjust this, how much tension there is. I can do really slow, gentle moves and everything else. So this is actually a satchel tripod that we've got that camera on right now. So, small camera, you don't need a tripod anywhere near this big or this size, but do talk to the guys here at Visual Impact if you are looking at something like this or any professional camera, and ask for some honest advice about tripods. And do be prepared to spend a reasonable amount of money. A good tripod, unfortunately, is not going to cost you £100. It's going to be quite a bit more than that for a good one. But the good thing about tripods is that if you buy a good tripod from day one, that will last you 20 years. I have a tripod that I'm still using today that's nearly 20 years old, and it's actually one of the best tripods that I've got. And it's a very heavy one, heavy duty one, but they last. Mechanical stuff like that, proper engineering doesn't tend to break. So invest wisely, invest well in your tripod, and it will last you many, many years. Moving on through the questions that we've got. Who at Sony came up with calling the normal shooting modes custom? Makes no sense. Right, so the reason it's called custom is because you can customize it. So you can, it isn't just one shooting mode. So actually custom mode on these cameras can be made to look very, very different. Let's go back to the Z280. I think that would be the best camera just to, actually I'll use the FX9 to show you. So the whole idea behind custom mode is it is customizable. It is not a given look. You can change the way it looks. And we have all sorts of presets and different settings in custom mode to make the camera look quite different. So let's bring up the FX9. And if I go into the main menu on the camera and I go to my paint settings, you'll see I have lots of choices here. So in particular, gamma curve, this is a very important setting. I can go down to the category. Original is S Cinetone, and I can choose between standard, you can see the contrast changes a bit, hyper gamma, S-Log 3. And I can just really change the way this picture looks. Let me zoom out a little bit. So one of the things with standard, if we compare it to S-Cinetone, is if we look at the highlight on the vase, and we look at the original, with the S-Cinetone, that bright highlight on the vase just tends to look a little bit more natural. When we're looking at standard, which is our normal television style gamma curve, it looks very electronic. You can see it's clearly overexposed, just has that sort of whole video look to it. So that's standard, and then original, which is the S-Cinetone. So we could do things like changing the gamma curves. Now, the other thing we can do is I can also change a bit further down something called the matrix. And we have different color matrix settings here. So these all look a little bit different. You can see the reds changing, and I go to the standard. We can go to FL light. So FL light, so this particular matrix is designed for shooting under artificial lights. So that would be LED lights or office lights, in particular low quality lights that tend to be a little bit green. The lights we've got in here are quite good, so you're not really seeing what it does, but it actually very slightly reduces the green tint that you get from artificial lighting. Then we could go to the cinema matrix here, then we have 709, and we have 2020. So these all provide you with different looks, and the whole reason that this is called custom is you can customize the way your picture looks, changing the colors, and changing everything about it, so it's customizable. I can even go in here, I can go into something called the user matrix, and I can really change things around. I can increase the level to have a much more vibrant, much more colorful look. You could really go to town in here and create some really quite nasty looks, as well as some quite beautiful looks. So that's why it's called custom mode, because it's fully customizable. And that's the whole idea behind that. And of the Sony cameras, how much customization do you get? So the FX9, the Z280 here, Z190, which we don't have as well, the same. They're all broadly similar, have the same paint settings and everything else. The FX6, this one here, is a little more limited. It has a slightly different system. It works a different way. But what you can do with this camera is you can load in your own custom looks called base looks into the camera. And you can load in lots and lots of different looks and have a wide variety of different looks and settings. The little Z90 here, this is customizable as well. You have picture profiles in this camera, and there are preset picture profiles. Each one gives you a different look. There's one that mimics the way a stills or a photo camera would look. There's one that's a little bit more film-like, using a gamma curve called cine gamma, and a film-like color matrix. So again, this is all customizable. It's very easy. You just press the little picture profile button. Don't know if you can see that. Just here. And then you can go in and change those picture profile settings. And no matter what you do, you can't break the camera by playing with the picture profiles. So I would really encourage anybody that hasn't gone in there and played to dive in and see what you can do, because not everybody's going to like the same look, and different projects might want different looks. If you're shooting a news story, you probably want to be pretty much run-of-the-mill, standard, nothing fancy, nothing special about your way your picture looks, because different news bureaus and agencies will want it all to look the same. If you're shooting a movie, you might want a more film-like look. If you're shooting a TV commercial, you might want to bring up the colors and the saturation to make it look really punchy and vibrant. And there's nothing that says you must always use a camera with one set of settings all of the time. You know, chop and change. It's part of the pleasure, part of the joy of being a cinematographer, filmmaker, whatever it is you call yourself, is going in and changing the way your camera looks to suit what you're shooting. So do dive in, do fiddle around. If it all goes horribly, horribly, horribly wrong, well, all of these cameras, if we go into the menu, they will always have way, way down in the, either in the maintenance or settings menu, there is the magic all reset that takes you back to the beginning and gets rid of any weird settings that you might have ended up with. But don't be afraid to dive in and play. So let's see what else. Okay, how would I justify the jump from FX6 to FX9 to Venice? Ooh, that's an interesting question. So FX6 to FX9 to Venice. I don't have a Venice here. I can show you a picture of a Venice though. Venice. I'll get it in focus, shall we? So that's what Venice looks like. A little bit bigger than my FX9 here. It's a slightly bigger camera. It's heavier. I think it really depends on what you're doing. I know Sony would love me to get everybody watching this to go out and buy a Venice right now, because it's an expensive camera, and I'm sure that would help Sony make lots of money. That would make me look absolutely wonderful. So please do go out and buy lots and lots of Venices right now, because then maybe I'll get asked to do more of these events. But putting my sensible and more realistic head on right now, it really depends on what you do. In terms of picture quality, the difference between this, the FX6, and the FX9 is, to all intents and purposes, zero. So why would you perhaps move from an FX6 to an FX9 if the picture quality looks the same? Well, the reason has to be there more to do with what you shoot. The FX6 is a really great, very, very capable camera that can actually do what 90% of people perhaps want. Full frame shooting, 4K, HD, you have the S-Log mode, all of those nice things, really great looking picture. But what it doesn't have, one of the things in particular it doesn't have, or is it's tied to, is full frame. So the only way to shoot 4K with the FX6 is in full frame. The FX9 has what's called a Super 35 mode. So that's a little bit smaller than full frame. And the reason why that's important is that for probably the past 30 or 40 years, is the majority of film and feature film production is being done with this smaller frame size. And as a result of that, the range of lenses that's available for Super 35 is vast. And then we come down to this, we've already talked about this issue with zoom lenses. When we go down just that little bit in sensor size, and also because film has been using this Super 35 size for a very, very long time, there's a much wider range of zoom lenses in particular available for Super 35 compared to full frame, and those zoom lenses are cheaper. So if you were shooting Super 35 on here, you could use Sony's 18 to 110 millimeter lens instead of the 28 to 135. There's also lenses like the Fujinon MKs, very, very nice film style lenses that don't cost the earth. They're quite affordable. And simply by going down to Super 35, you open up a whole world of different glass and different lenses that you can use. And if we're brutally honest, your picture, your image starts with the lens. So the quality of the lens that you put on the front of your camera determines everything else behind it. This is a brilliant camera, but if I put a rubbish lens on it, it's going to make rubbish pictures. If I put a really beautiful lens on here, a Zeiss Supreme or something like that, it's going to produce really beautiful pictures. And having the ability to shoot with full frame or with Super 35 really opens up the range of lenses that you can use, including a lot of classic cinema lenses, some of which look really nice, like some of the older Cooks and things like that. The other thing we get with the FX9, it's coming in the next firmware version 3, is the ability to have a 2K center scan mode. Now, excuse me, because this is a 6K full frame sensor, the camera only records 4K, but it's a 6K sensor, we can have multiple sizes. We can have full frame recording 4K from a 6K sensor. We can have Super 35. We can also, which we'll get in version 3 firmware, a center scan that is 2K that you can use for HD production. And when we go down to that much, much smaller Super 16 size, we have the ability to use the sorts of lenses that you'd find on a lot of television, news cameras and studio cameras, ENG zoom lenses. And the zoom range goes out to sort of 20, 40, even 50 times compared to the sort of 5 times that we have at full frame. So as we go down and down and down in sensor size, we tend to be able to have longer and longer zoom ranges. So that really then opens up the possibility to use an FX9 for both television news and that quick sort of almost Z280 style shooting by using the Super 16 mode and an ENG lens. But you know, obviously that's not cheap. You've got to buy a separate lens, the camera and everything else. Come back to this Z280, the cost of this. What is the cost of this? Do we know? Everyone's frantically looking at their notes in the background here. So it's about 6K. This is 6K. By the time you've bought an ENG zoom lens and perhaps the adapters and everything else that you need to do that, for this, you're probably looking at spending 2 or 3K at the minimum for an ENG zoom lens and adapter and everything else. Frankly, you might be better off just buying one of these as a secondary camera. It gives you a backup and everything else. That's a decision that you need to make for yourself. So we have great flexibility here. Why would you then go up to Venice? Well, Venice is all about picture quality. It doesn't have, well, it does have a 4K Super 35 mode, but it doesn't have a Super 16 mode. But if you ever use a Venice camera and you put it side by side with one of these, while the images broadly look the same, and you could probably cut between them in a lot of productions and never notice the difference, there is just something about that Venice image that is just that little bit better. And if you test it and you analyze what the pictures are doing and what the camera is doing, you can see things like the accuracy of the color is just that little bit better. The performance in very low light is just that little bit cleaner. The whole way that image looks is just a little bit nicer. The highlights are just that tiny bit better. Now, these aren't big differences. They are really, really small differences. But the thing is, if you're shooting a feature film, if you're shooting a movie, you have a vast budget, and each day you'll be spending hundreds of thousands of pounds potentially on cast, on crew and sets and the whole production. So the extra cost of hiring a Venice compared to an FX9 becomes irrelevant. That tiny little extra cost in a budget of thousands and thousands of pounds every day isn't going to make a difference to the final budget. So why wouldn't you use a Venice in that case? And when I'm shooting some of the commercials and things like that I do, I will use a Venice. I've got my own FX9 and it's a brilliant camera, I love it. But if I'm doing a commercial where the budget is there, the difference in higher cost really between an FX9 and Venice becomes irrelevant. So you choose the best camera that you can get because you can afford it. And that's why I would move up to a Venice. And the XOCN, the 16-bit RAW recording that you have from Venice is just a superb format to work with in post-production, that full 16-bit. Very, very easy to work with as well. Okay, so What else have we got here? As there's so little difference in the cost of an FX3 and an FX6, why would you ever go for the FX3? Size. Really, it all comes down to size. The real world cost difference, a couple of £1,000 between little FX3 here and FX6 here. And just holding these two cameras right now, I can feel how much lighter this is. This will fit in my pocket. This won't. Even if I take off all the rigging stuff that's on here, it's not going to go in my pocket no matter how hard I try. This will. I was thinking about this just the other day because I sort of saw it and thought, well, why would you buy it? What is the point of this camera? And I travel a lot. I travel to Norway to film the Northern Lights. Is one of the big things I do each year. Haven't been able to this year because of COVID and all the restrictions, and this was going to be the camera that I would have taken, the FX6. Very, very good in low light, proper video camera, ND filter, reasonably small. I've also got the FX9. Now, last year I took the FX9 and I got some really great images, but this is just that little bit smaller, a little bit more compact. And when I'm traveling on a snowmobile, traveling around, I've just got perhaps a backpack on. Having a small camera like the FX6 compared to the FX9 is going to be much easier. I thought, right, I'll take the FX6 to Norway, and on a lot of my trips, this will be the camera that I'll use. And then I saw the A7S Mark III, and I kind of dismissed it. I don't really know why. I think I am very much a video guy, not a stills guy. And then this comes along and throws really actually a bit of a spanner in the works, because for my Norway trips, why take the FX6 when I can take this? And essentially the picture quality is the same. There is virtually no difference in the image quality. It's the same sensor, a lot of the same processing. These are so closely related. Now, what I don't have with this is the ND filter, and I will definitely miss not having that lovely variable ND in here. Why isn't there a variable ND in this? Well, it would make this camera much bigger. The body of this camera is absolutely packed with electronics. The ND filter has to have space to be moved out of the way when you're not using it. So to fit the ND filter in here, the variable ND filter, it probably would have got thicker, because the electronics that's right here around the lens would have to be moved out of the way, and probably the camera body a little bit longer, one side or the other, so that the ND filter can be moved out of the way when you don't want it. So this would have become a bigger camera if they'd put the ND filter in here. And by the time you've done that, and other people have said, well, why doesn't it have SDI? Why doesn't it have this, that, and everything else? If that's what you are going to add, SDIs, ND, and all those other things, then you end up with one of these, and you're up to this sort of size, weight, and everything else again. So a lot of these things are about the trade-offs and compromises that you have to sometimes accept to get what you want in a smaller package. And for me, actually, in particular for my Norway trips, this ticks so many boxes: size, weight, compact. You've got fan cooling in there, so you can shoot with it all day long. You've got the XLRs with the hand grip if you want it. It does tick a lot of the boxes that I want. Of course, I would like it to have the ND filter, but only if it keeps it small, because that's the reason why I would want to take this to Norway, because it's small. Put the NDs in, it becomes bigger, heavier, and all the rest. Well, I may as well just take my FX6. So that's why I actually do like this camera. Would it replace an FX6? No. It is a camera to coexist with the FX6, to supplement or to complete that cinema line. I do think that what Sony are currently doing with the cinema line is quite clever. It's not perfect, but basically what they're giving everybody is a camera with the same or remarkably similar image quality, whatever your budget and whatever the type of shooting that you want to do. So whether that is an A7S Mark III, which isn't really in the cinema line, or the FX3 at the bottom, going all the way up to FX9 or Venice, there's something really for everyone. FX9 is a fantastic camera for news because it's got all the streaming capabilities and everything else that you need for news applications. FX6 is a great independent filmmaker's camera. It doesn't have the streaming, it can't even record interlaced inside, but if you're an independent filmmaker, who cares? But it does produce a beautiful image, and it's a lot cheaper. And then you can go down to this if you need something that's really discreet, something you can put in your pocket, something you could perhaps go and film somewhere where you're not supposed to be filming at a quality level that's damned close to Venice. So actually, I really do like where it's going. Okay, so footage I shot will be part of an archive to be used in many videos. Will S-Log allow the most flexibility in the future, even if I'm just putting on an S-Log to 709 LUT for the moment? Short answer there is actually yes, you're quite right. Is that by shooting right now with 4K and with S-Log, you're creating something that has a great lifespan. I know we've already seen from Sony the A1 camera, which can shoot 8K. I think if we're being really realistic about 8K, yes, there are benefits for it in some applications. Don't get me wrong, I'm not poo-pooing 8K by any means, but we're barely getting to the point where people are shooting, where 4K is common now. We've only just got to that point. I think 8K is quite a lot bigger step in terms of the workflow and the pipeline, monitoring, who has 8K monitors, and all of those things. Yes, you can crop into it and do things like that. I appreciate that. But I almost think 8K right now is a step too far, simply because the files are going to, your post-production files, not so much the camera files, but you start converting your masters to ProRes and everything else in 8K, and they get pretty big pretty quickly. And will the audience be able to see the difference? I really don't believe they will. Right now, you struggle to see the difference between really well shot HD and equally well shot 4K. If the HD's been done well, it looks fabulous. And unless you're very close to a very big screen, it can be quite difficult to tell the difference between that and 4K. And the difference between 4K and 8K is even smaller, much, much smaller. So I think that your general audience at home will really struggle. I don't think Netflix and all of the streaming platforms are ready for 8K. Yes, you can do it. You can stream in 8K, but we're not there yet. I think this is still something that's some time off. So by producing now 4K with S-Log 3, you can then grade it, or if you put it in your stock footage library or however you're selling it as S-Log, then the customer can grade it to the way they want it to look. So if they want it to fit in a specific production with a specific style, they'll be able to do that. If they want to have a HDR version, they'll be able to create an HDR version from the S-Log. If they only need 709, they can do that from the S-Log. So yes, absolutely. The question that I have that's sort of buzzing around in my own mind right now is, is S-Log the best, or should you be considering RAW? Now, if you've got Venice, there's no argument you'd shoot XOCN and the 16-bit RAW that could shoot, but most of us don't have a Venice. If I'm using a camera like the FX9 here, I can put the XDCA back on it, I can get a 16-bit output, and then I can record it on an external recorder, such as, got the little Atomos Ninja here. And it takes that 16-bit RAW and converts it to 12-bit linear RAW, very, very high 12-bit log RAW, very, very high quality conversion, visually lossless, and gives you a ProRes RAW master. And that ProRes master contains probably more picture information than the internal recordings on these cameras. It's not a night and day difference, but there's definitely more. And arguably that would be an even better master. However, you've got to wonder about how many people want ProRes RAW, because ProRes RAW essentially only works with an Apple workflow. At the moment, your sort of the main edit and grading application most people are using is DaVinci Resolve, doesn't accept ProRes RAW directly. So you've got to go through some hoops if that's what you want to do. So I'm a little undecided actually whether to say ProRes RAW would be a better master or whether the S-Log 3 would be a better master. Frankly, I'm thinking S-Log 3 right now because that works in every edit application. There's no limitations, whereas there are some limitations with the ProRes RAW. So any plans to update the firmware on the FX6? I hear there are problems shooting 10-bit 4K interframe. Yeah, it does eat up the cards. It's a big fat codec. It's if you're shooting at 50, 60p, it's nearly 600 megabits per second. That's what you get with a high quality codec. The whole point of this camera is to deliver a very high quality image cost effectively. SD cards are not expensive in the grand scheme of things. Just to put that into some perspective, I quite like to look back at when I first started shooting video, which was on a format that was called U-matic. And it was a tape format. The recorder was about that big, it was about that thick, and the sound recordist always looked like that because he had it hanging over one shoulder. And us cameramen, well, we always looked like that because we're all trying to support the camera on this shoulder. So between us, we were all slowly becoming cripples, and it wasn't doing anybody's backs any favors. But the thing about U-matic is, and I'm trying to find something that's comparable, is that the tapes, they were about that big, about just over an inch thick, 30 millimeters in modern money. One tape used to cost me about 20, 25 pounds. And this is going back 20, 30 years ago. So in today's money, 40 pounds, something like that. And it only lasted 20 minutes. And you could only realistically, well, very often you could only use them once because the recorder would eat it. If the recorder hadn't eaten it, you might get 5 or 6 uses out of it, out of a single 30-pound tape. And it only lasted 20 minutes. The SD cards, this is actually a CF Express card that's in here, but an SD card, 128 gigabyte SD card, costs about £100, just over £100, holds about an hour. So your cost per minute isn't actually that different to what I had 30 years ago. But I'm going to be able to use this hundreds, if not thousands of times. And the quality won't degrade. This stuff isn't expensive. If you're buying, I come across this a lot, is people are perfectly happy to spend £6,000 to buy a camera like this, but then balk at spending £100 on a card. You really have to consider the media part of the package, part of the investment. You can't have the one without the other. The media is absolutely integral to this camera. And you are going to have to consider buying a sensible amount of media to shoot with. You know, if we compare the cost of SD cards to XQD cards, so 128 gigabyte XQD card, which is what this camera takes, the FX9, is 4 times the price of an SD card. So FX6 and media is definitely not something that I think you can consider to be expensive. If you want image quality, if you want a higher quality image, you pay a price in that the files get bigger so that you have less compression, fewer artifacts, you can grade it more, grade it better, all of those good things. Yes, you might be able to do some firmware changes to put a smaller codec in there, maybe even H.265, but you do lose image quality when you do that. It's not as good. So, you know, is there going to be a firmware update? I have no idea. I'm under NDA from Sony. If I did know, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I've not heard any rumors. I suspect this is pretty much a finished camera. There might be some small tweaks that come. Perhaps there's a few things maybe we'll see, but I wouldn't count on it. I think you really have to consider any camera that you buy. And I think this is, I know people don't like hearing this from me. I say this a lot, and people don't like hearing it because it's not the story they want to hear. But I would really say to you, when you buy a camera, consider it finished. Don't expect that Sony are going to upgrade it magically. Now, if Sony, when you buy it, has said, we will be adding these features, X, Y, Z, for example, we know the FX9 will get version 3 firmware with that 2K center crop mode, that's been well publicized and by Sony, then that's fine. You can accept that as part of what you are buying. You're buying this camera with a future firmware update that will do that. But if Sony haven't said, we're going to be adding features, I think you have to be realistic, and when you make your purchase, consider that that is what you're buying. Of course, we would all like more free firmware. Who doesn't like free firmware and free upgrades? Of course we do. And of course we'd all like, you know, to have loads of extra features for nothing. But R&D and development takes a lot of time. An awful lot of what these cameras do is entirely determined by the hardware and can't be changed through firmware. So don't buy a camera in the hope that a feature that hasn't been mentioned is going to be added. That would be a mistake. Buy it for what it is and make the best use out of it. You know, the FX9, FX6, FX3 all produce beautiful images right out of the box, and the firmware isn't buggy. Sony spend months testing their firmware, going through every possible combination of button pushes and button presses. Yes, a few things do get through every now and again, and we've seen a couple of things. I think there was one in version 2 of the FX9 in a specific codec in a specific set of features where you would get a glitch across the picture. But Sony quickly pulled that firmware release and fixed that problem. So things every now and again do creep through, but generally speaking, the Sony firmware is really solid and reliable. They know they're making a product that might be used for broadcast and other critical things, weddings, events like that, where it's just simply not acceptable to have bugs in the firmware. So they spend a lot of time going through it. And it's one of the reasons why firmware like the version 3 that we're going to see for this camera takes so long to come. It's not just writing the firmware, it's then testing it and testing it and testing it again to make sure that it's all safe and not going to let you down. Right, so any more questions? I don't, is there a camera setup I'd recommend? No, covered that one. I think we've covered all the questions that I can see that have been put forwards. So before I wrap things up, if you do have a question, get typing before I finish off. Before I do that, though, the one thing that I wanted to do, which is why we restarted the stream, is audio. This is another one of those areas that often gets forgotten. So people will spend a lot of money on a camera because the camera's sexy. This is cool to have a camera like this. You know, this is your baby, my baby, this one. This is what people spend all their money on, is the camera. The camera is your headline device, and people, you see it all the time, will put every single penny they've got into the camera, and that's fine. But they forget that the camera is only ever as good as the tripod it's on. I could put a lovely camera on a wobbly tripod and it's going to ruin my shots. The same with audio and the same with sound. So I'm using a Sony UWPD radio mic right now. So I've got a belt pack on, looks like this, with what's commonly called a tie-clip mic or a lavalier mic. It's just here. And these are great because I can move around. I can move about in this space. They're quick, they're easy to work with. And then on the FX9 here, we've got Sony's, I'll just take this off actually, and the UWPD single channel receiver on an MI shoe adapter. And these are actually the slightly older mics. There is a new version of these mics now, they're a little bit smaller. Broadly the same thing, but just a bit smaller. The beauty about this MI shoe is that when it's on the camera here and plugged in, no wires, no cables, the microphone receiver is powered by the camera, and that gives me up to 2 channels of audio in here. If you have the 2-channel receiver, which is actually what I've got here, I don't think you can see that. This is the 2-channel receiver. Very similar, but with 2 channels. That can take 2 separate radio mics into the camera, and I can still have my external mic on the camera. Now, the only issue with radio mics is that they can be prone to interference. The UWPD is a hybrid digital and analog system, so it has a digital compander that improves the quality, especially the sound, those hisses, those S's. And then the transmission is analog, and they've got good range. They work generally pretty well. But if you were filming something like arc welding, something with a lot of electrical interference, you could get problems with your audio. And because it's a FM radio system, there's always a tiny, tiny bit of hiss way down in the background, but it is there. When you use a hardwired mic, so if I was to take this exact same type of mic, but hardwire it into the camera, then of course there won't ever be any hiss in the background, but then your presenter's on the end of a cable. And that tends to slow things down. So for the majority of what I do, these are what I use. Or 90% of what I shoot is with these. Now, often if you're shooting drama, have a look at your actors in your scene, and you might see that on their shirt or jumper there's a patch, like they've got a band-aid or a plaster on the inside of their shirt. And that's actually because they're using this type of mic, but instead of having it here on the outside, it's stuck on the inside of their costume and also stuck to them. So you have to stick it to both the costume and to the person so it doesn't rub. So as they move around, the microphone isn't rubbing against the fabric. So you have a special sticky attachment that attaches to them and the fabric. So even in movies and productions like that, the sort of lavalier type radio mic is still the most commonly used type of microphone. Now, the other type of microphone that's very commonly used, especially for news or for interviews, is this type of microphone. This is a shotgun microphone or a gun microphone. And these tend to sound and they work very differently. And you can get different lengths. So this is a ECM VG1, and this is another gun microphone here. Let's take the cover off. And this is another one. It's an ECM 680S. And you can see it's quite a bit longer. Now, the difference the length tends to make is how directional they are. The longer the microphone, the more directional it tends to be, and also more expensive. These are both, this is a mono microphone, so this is mono. This one's actually stereo or mono, it's switchable. So I can switch this microphone between mono or stereo depending on what I'm doing. So if I was using this as my sort of Atmos mic to capture my sort of ambient sound, I would use it as a stereo mic. If I'm doing an interview, I would switch it. You've just got a couple of switches on there, and I would switch it to mono to use it as a mono interview mic. Now I've got this one plugged into the FX9. So let me just bring up, hopefully this will work. I'm going to turn off. Right, so we should be now on this microphone. And you should be hearing that the audio sounds very, very different. And this is one of the things, is that the lavalier mic here picks up a lot of sound coming through your chest. So it often has a very bassy sound, almost a little bit unnatural sometimes. So if we go back to the lavalier. So this is the lavalier mic, quite a sort of bassy sound. And that's that classic actually sound that you get with movies and a lot of productions because of where the microphone is. And then we go to the gun microphone again. So we're back on the gun microphone now, and it's a very different sound. And actually, generally speaking, a gun microphone like this produces a more natural sound, much more like the sound you would hear if you were talking to somebody, because it's hearing the sound coming out of my mouth rather than the sound coming from my chest. Now, the other thing is these mics are very directional. So if I point it away from me, you'll hear it goes very, very echoey, and you're probably struggling to hear me. And as soon as I bring it back towards me, the audio becomes clearer and more directional. The lavalier mic here is barely directional at all. I can turn this microphone around, pointing it in all sorts of directions, and the sound isn't going to change. So what you're probably finding, hang on, is with the lavalier mic, it's possibly quite, I can't hear this myself, it's possibly quite echoey because it's picking up the sound coming from all around in this room. When we go to the gun microphone, so back on the gun microphone now, yes, just check it out. Yeah, back on the gun microphone, because it's so much more directional, it's going to pick up a lot less echo. And when you're doing an interview, sit-down interview in particular, one of the things you'll often see that people doing is the interview's mounted above, just out of the shot, pointing down at the interviewee. So it's just out of the frame. And then that gives a really nice sound. And because it's pointing down, we have carpet in this room, tends to be a little bit less echoey, and you get really nice sound. So something to think about in your budget is microphones. I would suggest most people buying a good radio mic kit as a good starting point. They're really useful. But if you're trying to do an interview, in a really noisy situation, if you're doing television news, things like that, there's traffic on a road, a riot and loud noises and things like that, the directional capabilities of a shotgun mic help isolate all those background sounds and those background noises. So they're different mics for different purposes. You can plug these into a belt pack transmitter, so you can actually plug this into this. You can make it wireless if you want. At the moment, it's on a cable. And most now, unfortunately, when you buy a camera, they don't actually come with microphones. So I've actually added one on this. This is my own FX6, and I have a little short shotgun microphone on there. That's another Sony microphone. That is doesn't have a model number, but that's another little stereo gun mic, because I find that to be better than the camera's built-in mic. And if I need to suddenly do an interview, I can always just take it off the camera, plug in a cable, and I've got a microphone that I can get in there to get the story. So I'm just going to go back to the lavalier mic. Right, so back on the tie clip microphone. Okay, so Matthias is getting his baby. I presume that's either an FX6 and not a small child tomorrow. Do enjoy when it arrives. A few more questions have come in, actually. Let's have a look. So currently shooting on the Z280 for corporate, but I need better pictures. I want bokeh on the interviews and shots, looking at moving to the FX3, which is pushing the budget, and other alternatives. Yeah, if you want that film-like look, being completely realistic, Z280 is a great camera for what it is, but it's not really, or it's very hard work to get that film-like look. You can do it by moving the camera back and zooming in more. So the longer your focal length, the shallower the depth of field becomes. So the way to do it in that scenario is to just simply move the camera further away if you have the space, so you can zoom in, you can use a longer focal length, because it's the use of a longer focal length that gives you that shallower depth of field. And you can get some way there with the Z280. But if you really want those more film-like looks, then yes, I think realistically you want to move up to a large sensor camera like the FX3. But I know Sony want me to sell, the whole point of this event is to encourage people to buy new cameras, but don't be afraid to look at secondhand. I mean, these new cameras, the FX3, FX9, etc., FX6, with S-Cinetone, with the new color science, they are beautiful looking cameras. But the previous generation of cameras, the FS7, FS5, are also very capable of producing beautiful images. If you want that shallow depth of field look, think about a second-hand FS5 or an FS7. They can be picked up very cheaply right now, because those of us that can afford them, that have got deep pockets, are moving to these new cameras because they're lovely. But if you don't have such a deep pocket, if you are working on a much smaller budget, there are some really nice bargains to be had with the FS5 and even the FS7. So don't discount used cameras. These cameras these days, they're solid state. They don't have tape decks. They don't have all the moving mechanical parts that older cameras used to have. So it's been well looked after. They will last for years and years and years. They don't really wear out. So just because this is the latest and greatest, just because this is the camera that everybody is talking about today, it doesn't mean that the previous generation, FS5, etc., are obsolete. They're not. They are still very capable and very good cameras. And really, the biggest thing that makes a difference to how your images look is you. It's not the camera. The camera is a tool. It's like a hammer. And a carpenter, in terms of making a cabinet, it's not so much the tools that the cabinet maker uses, it's his skill that makes the difference. So don't be afraid to buy a previous generation camera, FS5, FS7, because they are still today capable of producing beautiful images. Even last year I was still using, I was using my own FS5 until very, very recently, and it still delivers the results. So don't be afraid to do that, to consider that. If you can't afford any of the others and you desperately want a new camera, then FX3 or possibly A7S Mark III. Depends on your personal preferences. One of the big things with this, if you're doing broadcast work or anything you've got to shoot for a long time, is this is cooled. There's a fan in here. It's very, very quiet. You can barely hear it. So you can actually shoot all day, non-stop with this, and it won't overheat. There is the potential for the A7S Mark III to overheat in certain scenarios if you use it to try and shoot for too long in one take in particular. So just do bear that in mind. I'm not quite sure I follow the question from George about audio. I seem to only have half a question. And it records 3 separate WAV files or bakes all third together. I'm not sure what that refers to. It's possible that it might be the stereo radio mic receiver that actually has 2 channels out plus a third input. If you use the third input, that third input is mixed with the other 2 channels and you can't separate them. When you record with these cameras, they record 4 audio channels, and you can't just have 1 or 2. It has to record. It's part of the format, and that's the way the file system works. So the edit software and everything expects 4 channels. If it doesn't get 4 channels, it thinks your codec is broken. So that's why you always have 4 channels when you're recording. What options do you have to control the FX3 remotely, and what do I think about them? So the FX3, I haven't tried it yet. It's a different app to the one that the FX6 and FX9 has, but I believe it's broadly similar. There is an app for your mobile phone, and you can remotely connect via Wi-Fi to the camera, and you can control the camera from a mobile phone, and you get a live view on the screen. So you have a wireless remote control. You also have on this side of the camera here, Sony's new multi-interface shoe. Now, I don't know yet what works with this camera and what does not, but I would imagine that even if it doesn't work right now, there will be remote controls available that use the LANC protocol, but on the multi-interface type connector. It's a bit longer than a USB connector that you'll be able to use to control this camera remotely. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't have a huge amount of experience with this camera just yet, but there are options that already exist. I've used the app with other cameras before, and it's quite good. You can certainly put it in to record, start and stop recording, zoom in, zoom out, and all the key things that you would want to use during shooting. And yeah, if you're using it as a B camera, what that means is if you're shooting a conference or something like that, maybe you're operating your main camera, you can have your B camera over there somewhere, have your phone here, and you can control the B camera and see what it's doing while you're shooting. So it's quite a nice bit of functionality to have. The audio inputs in the FX9 via the audio mics and shotgun, is that all one file? No. So the FX9 has 4 separate audio channels. So when I'm using the dual channel receiver up here, that would be 2 channels. And then I have 2 XLR inputs, and those are 2 more separate channels. Each one is a separate discrete channel. They are not mixed together in any way, shape, or form. So a very common practice actually is to have a shotgun mic, as we have here on this camera, on the camera when you're doing an interview. So in case there is some interference on the radio mic doesn't work for whatever reason, you still have sound via the shotgun microphone on the camera. And because they're on separate audio tracks, if this one is noisy and crackly, you can use this one instead. And that's one of the big things about having, especially with 4 channels of audio, because it gives you 2 stereo pairs. So you could have two tracks recording left and right off your main microphones or main audio, and then another 2 tracks recording left and right from a different source if you want. It's a very flexible and very versatile system. AF lenses for FX6, would you recommend any brands other than Sony? And if you want to use AF, well, this comes up all the time, is AF being autofocus. What I will say is this: if you buy a Sony lens and put it on a Sony camera, it will work. No question, no ifs, buts, maybes. How good is it going to be? You know, I haven't yet come across a what I would say was what I would call a bad Sony lens. Obviously, some are better than others. Yeah, the G Masters and those tend to be better than the lower cost lenses. Again, it's what you pay for. You pay for a high-end lens or a low-end lens, you get what you pay for. But every Sony lens that I've put on the FX6 or FX9 has worked. The autofocus has been satisfactory, at least satisfactory, and on most of the better lenses, it's stunningly good, almost seamless. If you put an adapter on, so if you're using an adapter to a Canon lens or some other brand of lens, it tends to be much less reliable. The adapter takes time to translate between the E-mount signal and the Canon or whatever format it is. That slows down the autofocus, introduces other issues. And generally speaking, if you're having to use an adapter, the autofocus won't necessarily be what you would hope for. It doesn't mean it won't work, but you may have more issues. The other thing is all of Sony's lenses are designed for video. E-mount started way back with a camera called the NEX cameras, and they shot video. So Sony have always had video in mind. Now, if I bring up the FX9 here, and I think we're in, let me put this into autofocus. And I have to switch. That's why I won't do it. To slide the focus ring forwards on the lens. So we have autofocus now on this camera. Now, one of the things that can happen with lenses that are not designed for video is when the camera changes focus. So if I bring my hand in here, hopefully it'll autofocus on my hand instead. Nope, hang on. There we go, that was a bit too close. Is you get very big changes in the background. Now, there's obviously some changes happening here because the camera is refocusing. It likes those flowers. Come on. I'm not sure what my focus settings are. It's one of the things to understand now about autofocus. If I move in here, there we go, it'll focus on me and come back to the flowers. One of the things that you get, an issue that you can get with autofocus is if the camera isn't sure about the focus, is sometimes you see the background changing. You don't see the camera going in or out of focus, you just see little glitches going on in the background, and that tends to happen with lenses that are not designed for video. With the Sony lenses, you don't normally see it. It's extremely rare to see that happening. In terms of third-party lenses, I have some experience with the Tamron lenses, the Tamron E-mount lenses. So there's a 17 to 28 and a 28 to 70 and then a 70 to 180. And they work actually surprisingly well. They're a budget lens. Sony will probably kill me for saying that because I'm supposed to be promoting Sony lenses, but if you are on a tight budget, they might be a consideration. But again, I can't stress enough the whole thing of, if you're looking at lenses and they're not Sony lenses, try and hire them, rent them, go to a dealer that has them and try them and experiment, because there's a lot of variation with third-party lenses. Use a Sony lens, you know it's going to work. It's what the camera is designed for, so all the chromatic aberration compensation will work, all the clever electronic stuff that goes on to make your lens look as good as possible will work, and that's guaranteed. Use a third-party lens, that's definitely not guaranteed. So try and test for yourself is my recommendation. What do I think of the Sony 12 to 24 millimeter lens for the FX6? I'm not familiar with that lens, I'm afraid. Are you sure that isn't a crop APS-C lens? Oh, actually, no, I think there is a 12 to 24 in full frame. I'm not familiar with that lens. I can't comment on that lens because I don't know it, I'm afraid to say. So we've really run on quite a lot. So there's no more questions that I can see. I can't see any questions I've missed, so we will wrap this up. I do hope you found this session useful. If you found it useful, do let the guys at Visual Impact know. The session has been recorded, and in due course, the recording of the session will go online so you can watch it again. You can miss out all the bits that you didn't find interesting and just go straight to the bits that you want to know more about. And as I say, do let the guys at VI know if you found the video useful. Can we do more? And if you're buying your kit, please talk to them. They're really nice guys here. Things are a little bit different because of COVID at the moment. There's not quite so many people in the office, but they're all still contactable, all still available to talk to you. If you want to buy something, they'll normally do you a nice price on stuff. It might not be an advertised price. Talk to them. They're good guys to deal with. I've worked with Visual Impact for 30 years. They started off in a lock-up garage selling secondhand gear, and I bought some kit from them, and I've been dealing with them ever since, and they've never let me down. So, build that relationship with your dealer up. I think it's a really important and valuable thing, because that day might come where your camera's broken for some reason. Maybe you've, like I did, dropped it in the sea, and you need a camera pretty quickly. If you know your dealer, and your dealer knows you, and they know you're a good customer, they're going to be far more interested in helping you as opposed to somebody that just buys the odd thing online randomly from wherever. So build up that relationship with your dealer. They're well worth it. That's what they're here for. That's how they get, they sell stuff to you. Some of that goes back into events and things like this to help you guys. So support your local dealer, and talk to them. And I'm sure they'll do you a good deal on any of the equipment that you've seen here today. So that's it from me, Alister Chapman, and hopefully we'll do some of these again soon. Have a good day. Goodbye.